December 16th, 1944. The forest was a cathedral of ice. Every branch of every pine tree in the Ardennes was encased in a transparent, glittering shell. The world had been silenced by the cold, a deep, penetrating cold that stole breath and hope in equal measure. Private First Class David Ellis of the 106th Infantry Division shivered in his foxhole, not from the temperature alone, but from the silence. The German offensive had begun hours ago, a roaring, monstrous thing to the north. But here, in this sector, there was nothing. His unit, a ragtag collection of clerks and cooks rushed to the front, had been ordered to hold this stretch of wooded line. Now they were cut off. The wire was dead. The only sounds were the creak of frozen trees and the frantic beating of his own heart, a crack of a twig. Ellis raised his M1 Garand, his numb finger resting on the trigger. A figure emerged from the grey fog between the trees. Not a German soldier. A ghost. A man in a tattered grey uniform, stumbling, his hands held high. He was emaciated, his face a skull barely covered by pale skin. His eyes were sunken pools of desperation. This was not an attack. This was a surrender. The German collapsed a dozen yards from Ellis's position. Ellis and another soldier, a man named O'Malley, cautiously approached. The German offered no resistance. He was barely conscious. As they searched him, they found no weapons, only a small, tarnished photograph of a woman and two children, tucked inside his threadbare tunic. His pockets were empty of food. This man had not been fed in a very, very long time. They dragged him back to their makeshift command post, a log dugout reinforced with sandbags. The company commander, a Lieutenant Barnes, looked at the prisoner with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They were surrounded, low on ammo and lower on food. They had nothing to spare. "Give him some of your rations, Ellis," Barnes ordered, his voice weary. Ellis hesitated. Their rations were meagre. A can of Spam, some hardtack, a bar of chocolate. It was all they had. But he opened his pack and took out the can of Spam. He used his knife to pry it open. The smell of salted pork and gelatin filled the cold air. The German prisoner, who had introduced himself as Hans, stared at the open can as if it were a religious artifact. His hands trembled as Ellis handed it to him. He did not devour it. He took a small, careful piece with his fingers and placed it in his mouth. His eyes closed. A single tear, instantly frozen on his cheek, traced a path through the grime. He looked at Ellis, his expression one of profound, earth-shattering disbelief. "So vile," he whispered, his voice cracking. "So much." He wasn't talking about the single can of Spam. He was talking about the concept of it, the abundance it represented. In that moment, Ellis understood. This was not just a prisoner of war. This was a man who had been starving, truly starving, for years. The American food, this simple, unremarkable, canned meat, was a glimpse into a world of plenty he could not have imagined. Suddenly, the sound of engines broke the silence. German engines. Tanks. Panzers. The ground began to tremble. Lieutenant Barnes grabbed the prisoner by the arm. "What do you know? What is coming?" Hans's eyes widened in fear. He shook his head. "I am nobody. A conscript. They told us we would eat. They told us the Americans had food for everyone. That is all." But as he spoke, his eyes darted to a map on Barnes's makeshift desk. He pointed a trembling finger at a location deep in the forest, a place not marked on any of their maps. "There," he whispered. "They are not looking for soldiers there. They are looking for the lager." The storage. "Storage for what?" Barnes demanded. "For what you have," Hans said, his gaze falling on the half-empty can of Spam. "For food." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. This massive German offensive, the spearhead aimed at Antwerp, was not just a military operation. It was a desperate, starving army lashing out, not only for fuel and ammunition, but for sustenance. Their intelligence had spoken of supply dumps, but they had assumed it was for petrol. What if the real target was something else? What if the Germans were so desperate for food that they had built a secret logistics network, hidden in the Ardennes, designed to capture and secure American provisions? The shelling started then. The world dissolved into noise and fire and splintered wood. In the chaos, the German prisoner, Hans, was forgotten in a corner of the dugout. Ellis saw him, huddled, clutching the photograph of his family, his eyes filled with a terror that went beyond the artillery barrage. He was terrified of going back to the hunger. When the shelling lifted, an eerie quiet returned, broken by the crackle of flames. The German attack had bypassed their position, surging forward towards larger objectives. They were still isolated, but they had a new mission, born from the shocked look in a starving man's eyes. A mission that was not on any operations map. Lieutenant Barnes gathered his few remaining men. His face was grim, smudged with powder and soot. "We're not going to try and break out to our lines," he said, his voice low. "Not yet." He pointed in the direction Hans had indicated. "We're going to find that lager. If the Germans are that desperate for food, then that storage facility is a strategic target. Maybe more important than a panzer division right now. We find it, we report its location, or we destroy it." It was a suicide mission, a handful of lost, under-equipped Americans, moving behind the spearhead of the entire German offensive. But they had seen the truth in that prisoner's eyes. This was a different kind of war, a war of starvation, and they had just been given a glimpse of the enemy's greatest weakness. They moved out, ghosts in the frozen forest. Hans, the German prisoner, came with them. He was their guide now. He had nothing to return to. The promise of American food was a siren's call he could not resist. He led them away from the roads, through dense thickets and icy streams. He moved with a purpose that surprised them. He was not just leading them to a location, he was leading them to his own salvation. After hours of marching, they found it. Not a warehouse, but a bunker. It was cunningly disguised as a natural rock outcrop, its concrete door covered in camouflaged netting. It was abandoned. The lock on the heavy steel door was shattered, as if it had been forced open from the outside. Cautiously they entered. The darkness inside was absolute and cold. Ellis switched on his flashlight. The beam illuminated a nightmare. The bunker was vast. It was lined with shelves, and on those shelves were not weapons, not ammunition, but food. Thousands upon thousands of cans, American cans, beef stew, Vienna sausages, fruit cocktail. But something was wrong. The cans were dusty, old. Their labels were faded, from another time. Ellis picked one up. The stamped code on the bottom made his blood run cold. It was not from 1944. It was from 1919. This was not a German supply dump. This was a relic, a storage facility from the last war, forgotten by time. But that was not the source of the horror. In the center of the bunker, arranged in neat, orderly rows, were bodies, dozens of them. They were German soldiers. They were not killed by bullets or shrapnel. They were skeletal, emaciated. They had starved to death. Surrounded by a mountain of food they could not open. The cans were sealed, their old openers long since rusted away. They had died in a tomb of plenty, a cruel, ironic hell. Hans let out a choked cry. He fell to his knees, staring at the grotesque scene. This was the lager he had heard whispers of, a place of myth where food was stored. But it was a trap, a historical trap. Lieutenant Barnes examined one of the bodies. He found a paybook. The man had been a member of the 5th Panzer Army, the same army that was now crashing through the American lines. He had been here for weeks, maybe months, guarding this place, waiting for supplies that never came. Dying for a lie. This was the unanswered mystery. Why had the German High Command stationed men here? Why let them starve, surrounded by food? Was it simple, brutal logistics, or was there something else? Ellis's flashlight beam caught something on the far wall. It was a map, pinned to a corkboard. But it was not a tactical map. It was a schematic, a diagram of a machine, and in the corner, stamped in black ink, was a symbol. A circle, bisected by 3 jagged, lightning-like cracks. Hans saw it too. His face, already pale, went as white as the snow outside. He backed away, shaking his head. 9, he whispered. Nicht das. What is it? Ellis asked, his voice tight. Hans pointed a trembling finger at the symbol. Avalon. The name meant nothing to Ellis. But the terror in Hans's eyes was real. This abandoned bunker, this tomb of starving men, was not an accident. It was connected to something larger, something hidden. The German prisoner had not just led them to food. He had led them to the edge of a secret that went far beyond the Battle of the Bulge. A secret that someone had killed and starved to protect. Part 4 complete. Do you want me to continue to Part 5? December 17th, 1944. The air in the bunker was frigid, thick with the dust of decades and the faint, sweet smell of decay. The beam from Private Ellis's flashlight trembled slightly as he stared at the schematic on the wall. The symbol, a circle with 3 jagged cracks, seemed to pulse in the dim light. Hans, the German prisoner, was backing away, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Avalon, he whispered again, the word a curse. You do not understand. You must not be here. Lieutenant Barnes grabbed Hans by the arm, not roughly, but firmly. What is Avalon? Is it a unit? A place? Hans shook his head, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond their American captors. It is an idea, a group. They are not of the war, not as you know it. He pointed a shaking finger at the starved corpses around them. This is their work. This is a calibration. Calibration? Ellis asked, the word feeling alien and dangerous in the confined space. The hunger, Hans said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. They study it. They measure despair. They map the breaking point of the human spirit. This bunker, it was not forgotten. It was an experiment. They wanted to see how long men would guard nothing, how long they would believe a lie before they turned on each other, or simply gave up. The horror of it settled over the American soldiers like a physical weight. This was not warfare. This was something from a nightmare. A psychological torture chamber on an industrial scale. Barnes released Hans's arm. Why? What could they possibly gain from that? Data? Hans spat the word. For their machines. For their project. Project Januskopf. I heard the officers speak of it in whispers. The men who wear this symbol. He pointed again at the schematic. They come and they take notes. They do not bring food. They bring instruments. O'Malley, the other soldier, kicked an empty, rusted can. It clattered across the concrete floor, the sound echoing loudly in the tomb-like silence. So what do? We can't report this. No one would believe us. We do not report it, Barnes said, his jaw set. We follow it. This schematic. Hans, what is this a diagram of? Hans approached the wall map with the caution of a man approaching a live serpent. He traced the lines with a dirty finger. It is a resonator, like for a radio, but not for sound. The doctors, they said it was for time, for listening to time. He looked at their disbelieving faces. I told you you would not understand. They believe time is a frequency, that the past and future can be tuned into, and that strong emotions, like the hunger and fear in this place, make the signal clearer. Ellis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He thought of the canned food from 1919. It wasn't just old supplies. It was a relic, placed here deliberately, a fixed point in time to amplify the signal of this horrible place. They're using this bunker as an antenna, Ellis said, the realization dawning on him. An antenna for human suffering. A sudden noise from the bunker's entrance made them all jump. The heavy steel door groaned, its rusted hinges screaming in protest. A figure was silhouetted against the grey daylight outside. A man in a long, dark coat, utterly out of place in the frozen forest. He stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him, plunging them back into near darkness. He clicked on a small, powerful flashlight, its beam sweeping over the scene of horror before settling on Lieutenant Barnes. You are trespassing, the man said. His voice was calm, mellifluous, and carried no discernible accent. This is a classified research site. Who are you? Barnes demanded, his hand moving subtly towards his sidearm. You may call me Director Valerius. I am with the ANNERB, he said, naming the Nazi occult research branch. But his demeanour, his perfect English, the cut of his coat, it was all wrong. This was something else. This was Avalon. Valerius's beam found Hans, who cowered behind Ellis. Ah. Subject 7. Theta. You were part of the control group. You were not supposed to leave your post. Your data is now compromised. They were starving, Ellis shouted, his anger overriding his fear. A necessary constant in the equation, Valerius replied, as if discussing the weather. Starvation focuses the mind. It strips away the superfluous. It reveals the core of a man. The data we have gathered here from these poor souls, he gestured to the corpses, is invaluable. It will help us perfect the resonance for the main array. The main array? Barnes asked. Valerius smiled, a thin, cold expression. You have seen the schematic. This is but a single node, a tuning fork. There are others, and they are all converging on a single glorious purpose, the retuning of history itself. He took a step forward. He was unarmed, yet he seemed to suck all the air from the room. The psychological tension was a wire, stretched to its breaking point. You will come with me, Valerius said, his voice dropping to a compelling whisper. Your experiences here, your shock, your rage, it is a potent signal, fresh data. You will be valuable additions to the project. We're not going anywhere with you, Barnes stated, drawing his .45 pistol. Valerius's smile did not falter. You operate under the illusion of choice. A charming, but outdated, concept. From the shadows at the rear of the bunker, 2 more figures emerged. They were dressed in strange, padded suits, their faces obscured by goggles and respirators. They carried devices that looked like rifles, but with dish-like antennae at their ends. Take them, Valerius said. The world dissolved into a nightmare of light and sound. The devices did not fire bullets. They emitted a piercing, high-frequency whine that felt like needles being driven into Ellis's ears. The very air in the bunker seemed to warp. The stacks of canned food shimmered, their forms blurring. For a split second, Ellis saw them not as dusty old cans, but as fresh, new supplies, their labels bright and clean. Then just as quickly they were rotten, bloated tins crawling with maggots. He saw the corpses on the floor twitch, their skeletal hands clawing at the air. A ghostly echo of their final, agonized moments filled the room, a chorus of weak, pleading voices begging for food. Hans screamed, clutching his head. The signal! It is pulling the echoes back. One of the Avalon operatives aimed his device at O'Malley. A wave of distorted air hit him. He cried out, stumbling backward. As he did, he began to age rapidly. His hair turned grey, his skin wrinkled, his back stooped. In less than 10 seconds, he was an old man, collapsing to the floor in a heap of too large clothing, gasping for breath. Ellis fired his M1 Garand. The report was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet struck the operative in the chest. There was no spray of blood. Instead, a shower of golden, luminous particles erupted from the impact. The operative staggered, looked down at the hole in his suit, and then vanished. He didn't fall. He winked out of existence. Their technology, Barnes muttered, firing his. 45 at the second operative. The same result. A burst of light. And then nothing. Valerius watched, his expression one of mild disappointment. Crude, so very crude. He raised his own hand. He held no device. But the air around him hummed with power. The remaining cans on the shelves began to vibrate, rattling like teeth. Ellis felt a profound dizziness, a sense of being pulled in 2 directions at once. The past is a weight, Valerius intoned, and the future is a pull. Let me show you the burden you carry. Ellis cried out as a searing pain shot through his mind. Visions, not his own, flooded his consciousness. He saw a muddy trench, the stink of cordite and blood, a German soldier with a bayonet, his face a rictus of hate. The Great War. He was experiencing the memory of the canned food. The terror and rage of the men who had first stored it here were now his. Barnes was on his knees, gripping his head. Hans was sobbing, trapped in his own private hell of remembered hunger. With a final, tremendous effort, Ellis raised his rifle. He wasn't aiming at Valerius. He was aiming at the massive, supporting beam near the bunker entrance. The wood was old, dry, and splintered. He fired. Once. Twice. The beam shattered. With a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, the roof of the bunker entrance collapsed. Tons of dirt and rock and snow cascaded down, sealing the doorway in an instant, plunging them into absolute blackness and silencing the high-pitched whine. The only sound was their panicked breathing. Ellis's flashlight, miraculously still working, cut through the dark. Valerius was gone. Perhaps he had escaped through another exit. Perhaps he had simply stepped into another time. They were alone, trapped, entombed in a grave of someone else's making, with the ghosts of starvation as their companions. Hans looked at Ellis, his eyes reflecting the dim light. In them, Ellis saw no hope, only a weary, resigned terror. They had stopped Valerius for now, but they had not escaped. They had only traded one nightmare for another. The Avalon group knew they were here, and they were buried alive. December 18th, 1944. The darkness was absolute. It was a physical substance, thick and heavy, pressing in on them from all sides. The air was stale, laced with the ancient smells of dust, decay, and a new, metallic tang of fear. Private Ellis's flashlight beam was a lone, feeble spear against the impenetrable black, illuminating the tons of earth and shattered timber that had sealed them in. The silence was worse than the artillery had been. It was the silence of a grave. Hans, the German prisoner, was the first to break. A low, guttural moan escaped his lips, escalating into a full-throated scream of pure, animal terror. He scrambled towards the collapsed entrance, clawing at the dirt and rock with his bare hands, his cries echoing in the tomb-like chamber. "We're buried, we are buried alive." Lieutenant Barnes grabbed him, pulling him back from the futile effort. "Stop it! That's not helping! Conserve your air!" The word air hung in the silence, a new, terrifying variable in their equation of survival. How much did they have? Hours? A day? Ellis's own breath suddenly felt precious, each inhalation a finite resource. The beam of his light swept across the bunker. It fell upon the body of O'Malley, or what was left of him. The temporal weapon had not just aged him, it had ravaged him. He was a desiccated husk, a century old, his final expression one of bewildered agony. Next to him lay the other starved German soldiers, their skeletal grins seeming to mock this new group of interlopers in their domain. "He's gone, David," Barnes said softly, using Ellis's first name for the first time. The formality of rank had died with the sunlight. "We need to focus on the living." The living. That was them. Barnes, Ellis, and the broken German prisoner, Hans. 3 men, trapped in a nightmare of someone else's design. Ellis's light travelled to the schematic on the wall. The circle with the 3 cracks seemed to taunt them. He said this was a resonator. "For listening to time." "Avalon," Hans whimpered, rocking back and forth. "They are listening to us now. They hear our fear. It is what they want." "Then we'll give them nothing," Barnes growled, though his voice lacked conviction. He walked to the shelves, staring at the cans of food from another war. "Our first priority is survival. We need to find another way out. And we need water." They began a methodical search of the bunker, their movements slow, deliberate, haunted by the spectre of suffocation. The space was larger than they had first thought, with several smaller chambers leading off the main room. One was a barracks, with rusted cots and the remains of personal effects from the Great War. Another was an armory, containing a few ancient bolt-action rifles, their wood rotten, their barrels clogged with rust, useless. It was in the 3rd chamber that Ellis found it. A desk, tucked away in a corner, and on that desk, a journal. The cover was made of a strange, smooth material that felt like leather but was too perfect, too durable. It was stamped with the Avalon symbol. He brought it back to the main chamber, where Barnes had managed to get a small flickering flame going, using some dried-out paperwork and a drop of fuel from a broken lantern. The light was meager, but it pushed back the oppressive gloom just enough to read. "It's in German," Ellis said, handing it to Hans. "Read it." Hans's hands trembled as he opened the journal. His eyes scanned the spidery script. He began to read aloud, his voice a hollow monotone. Entry, September 9th, 1941. The Nachtfalke facility is operational. The emotional resonance from the Eastern Front is potent. But it is chaotic, unfocused. We require a controlled source, a constant. Dr. Brandt has proposed the use of sustained privation. The hunger experiment is approved. He turned the page, his face growing paler. Entry, November 3rd, 1942. The results are exceeding expectations. The despair of the subjects here is creating a stable, low-frequency chronometric wave. It is perfectly attuning this location, making it a superlative receiver. We are now picking up clear signals from the summer of 1916. The Battle of the Somme. The suffering there is symphonic. Ellis felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. They were using human suffering as a tuning fork. This bunker was a radio dish, and the starving men were the power source. Entry, January 12th, 1944. A breakthrough. We are not just receiving, we can transmit. We have successfully sent a low-energy pulse back to this location, 24 hours into the past. The implications are staggering. We can create reinforcing loops. A moment of fear can be echoed, amplified, made eternal. We have created the first temporal prison. Hans looked up, his eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. The voices, the echoes we heard, they are not ghosts. They are recordings of suffering, being played back over and over again. The psychological weight of it was immense. They weren't just in a physical tomb, they were in a prison of recorded agony. The very air was thick with the echoes of men driven mad by hunger, their final moments trapped in an endless loop. Final entry, December 5th, 1944. The main array in the Alps is nearly complete. This node has served its purpose. The data stream is stable. We are initiating the final phase, the synchronization of all nodes for the Götterdämmerung event. This facility is to be abandoned. The subjects have reached their terminal point. Their final despair will serve as a permanent anchor, a monument to the power of Avalon. The journal fell from Hans's hands. They left them here to die, on purpose, to make this place permanent. The three men sat in silence, the flickering flame casting their long, distorted shadows on the walls of their shared tomb. The mystery was answered, and the answer was more horrifying than they could have imagined. They were sitting inside a battery charged with death and despair, built to power a machine that could rewrite history. It was Ellis who noticed it first. A faint, almost imperceptible draft. A whisper of cold air on his cheek. He held up his hand. "Do you feel that?" Barnes stood, his eyes searching the darkness. "Where is it coming from?" They followed the sensation, a ghost of moving air in the stagnant tomb. It led them to the rear of the bunker, to a section of wall that was stacked with empty crates. Moving them aside, they found it. A metal grate, about 2 feet square, set into the wall at floor level. An air vent. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through them. Barnes and Ellis grabbed the grate and pulled. It was rusted in place, but the metal was old and brittle. With a final, concerted heave, it came away with a shriek of tearing metal. The hole revealed was a narrow, downward-sloping shaft, carved directly into the bedrock. It was too small for a man to walk through. They would have to crawl. And it descended into an even deeper, colder darkness. "Where does it go?" Ellis whispered. "It does not matter," Hans said, a new determination in his voice. The discovery of the journal, the revelation of Avalon's cold, calculated evil, had burned away his panic, replacing it with a cold fury. "Anywhere is better than this tomb of echoes," Barnes nodded. "Ellis, you first. Then Hans. I'll bring up the rear." Ellis took a deep breath, his last look around the bunker searing the image of the starved soldiers into his memory. Then he got on his hands and knees and crawled into the shaft. The rock was cold and damp, scraping against his uniform. The darkness ahead was utter and complete. He did not know where it led. He only knew it led away from the hunger, away from the echoes, and towards, he hoped, a chance to make someone pay for the horror they had found. December 19th, 1944. The air in the shaft was frigid and smelled of wet stone and ozone. Ellis crawled forward, his world reduced to the feel of rough rock beneath his palms and knees, and the circle of weak light from his flashlight a few feet ahead. The descent was steep, treacherous. The sounds of their movement, the scuff of fabric, the clink of a canteen against rock, were swallowed by the oppressive silence of the mountain. They had been crawling for what felt like an eternity, the claustrophobic tunnel pressing in from all sides. Hope was a fragile thing, thinning with every yard they advanced into the unknown dark. Then the shaft ended. It opened abruptly onto a metal grating. Ellis stopped, shining his light down through the gaps. He saw not another tunnel, but a vast open space below. The air here was different. It was cool, filtered, and carried a faint, sterile hum of machinery. He pushed against the grating. It gave way, swinging downward on silent hinges. He lowered himself through the opening, dropping the last few feet to a clean, concrete floor. Barnes and Hans followed, landing softly beside him. They stood in a corridor, but it was unlike anything they had ever seen. The walls were smooth, poured concrete, illuminated by long, frosted glass panels that emitted a steady, shadowless white light. The floor was spotless. There were no wires, no pipes, no dust. It was eerily clean, eerily quiet. It felt less like a military installation and more like a hospital, or a morgue. "This is not German," Hans whispered, his voice full of awe and fear. "This is new." They moved down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the profound silence. Doors lined the hallway, made of a heavy, polished metal. Barnes tried one. It was unlocked. He pushed it open. The room within was a laboratory. But it was beyond any laboratory they had encountered. There were no bubbling beakers or tangled wires. Instead, there were rows of sleek metal consoles, their surfaces covered with dials and switches made of a strange, milky white material. In the center of the room stood a large cylindrical tank made of thick glass. It was filled with a clear, faintly blue-tinged liquid, and suspended within the tank was a human brain, trailing delicate wires and filaments that connected it to the consoles. Ellis felt his stomach lurch. My God! They backed out of the room and tried another door. This one revealed a barracks. But the bunks were not for soldiers. They were more like medical cots, each with a complex headboard containing monitoring equipment. The cots were occupied. Men and women lay perfectly still, their eyes closed, their faces serene. They were dressed in simple grey smocks. They were alive chests, rising and falling slowly, but they were utterly, deeply unconscious. Wires ran from temples to the headboards, where small lights blinked in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Hans approached one of the sleepers, a young man who could not have been more than 20. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the man's arm. It was warm, but the sleeper did not stir. "What is this place?" Ellis breathed. "What are they doing to them?" A sound from the corridor made them freeze, the soft, rhythmic tread of footsteps. Barnes signalled for silence, and they pressed themselves against the wall beside the door. The footsteps grew closer, then paused right outside. The door handle began to turn. As the door swung inward, Barnes moved. He grabbed the figure entering the room, clamping a hand over its mouth and pulling it back into the corridor, pressing his .45 against its temple. It was a woman. She was young, with sharp, intelligent features and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a pristine white lab coat over a grey dress. Her eyes, wide with shock, held no fear, only a cold, calculating anger. Barnes slowly removed his hand from her mouth. "One sound, and you're dead. Understand?" She nodded, her gaze sweeping over the three of them, assessing, categorizing. "You are the variables from the surface node," she said, her voice calm, accented but precise. The ones who disrupted the hunger resonance. Your emotional signature is chaotic. Who are you? Barnes demanded. I am Dr. Adler. This is my facility, a primary processing station for Project Mnemosyne. Processing what? Ellis asked. She looked at him as if he were a simple child. Data, of course. Cognitive and emotional data. The surface node you so crudely invaded was a collection array. It harvested the raw signal of despair. We refine it here. We filter it, digitize it, and prepare it for transmission to the core. She gestured with her chin towards the sleeping forms in the barracks. These are our converters. Their minds are the filters. We broadcast the raw emotional resonance into their subconscious. Their brains process it, converting pure anguish into structured information, a language the core can understand. The horror of it was so vast, so coldly scientific, that for a moment no one could speak. They weren't just harvesting suffering. They were using living human beings as processors to translate agony into a usable format. You're using them as living computers, Ellis said, his voice hollow. A crude analogy, but sufficient, Dr. Adler replied. Their dreams are our database. Every nightmare, every moment of terror from the world above is catalogued here. It is the fuel for the new world. The Götterdämmerung event, Hans said, the name from the journal a curse on his lips. Dr. Adler's eyes flickered with interest. So you have learned a little? Yes, the twilight of the gods. But it is not an end. It is a refinement. The core will use this data, the sum total of human fear, pain, and despair, to recalibrate reality, to create a timeline where such messy, inefficient emotions are obsolete. Barnes pressed the gun harder against her head. How do we stop it? You cannot, she said, a faint smile touching her lips. You are too late. The synchronization is underway, and you have brought a potent new data source directly to us. Your own terror, your rage. It is already being fed into the system. You are helping us even now. As she spoke, the lights in the corridor flickered. The steady white glow shifted for a fraction of a second to a deep, pulsing crimson. A low, subaudible thrum vibrated through the floor, a feeling of immense power being awakened deep below them. Dr. Adler's smile widened. You feel that? That is the core, drawing its first breath. Your journey ends here, variables. You will become part of the great work. Your minds will join the chorus. From the end of the corridor, two figures appeared. They were tall, clad in the same padded suits as the operatives in the bunker. They carried the same dish-like weapons. They moved with a fluid, unnatural grace. Barnes shoved Dr. Adler away and raised his pistol. Run! They turned and fled back the way they had come, towards the shaft that was their only escape. A pulse of distorted air shot past Ellis's head, striking the wall. The concrete didn't crater. It aged. It cracked and crumbled, turning to dust in the span of a heartbeat. They reached the grate and scrambled up into the narrow shaft, Barnes firing 2 covering shots down the corridor before climbing up after them. They crawled, faster now, driven by a primal fear. The sterile, silent facility was worse than the starving bunker. It was a place where the human soul was disassembled for parts. They burst back out into the main bunker chamber, gasping for air. The familiar scene of horror now felt almost comforting. It was a known evil. We have to warn someone, Ellis panted, leaning against a shelf of 1919 canned beef. We have to tell them what's down there. And who would believe us? Barnes asked, his face grim. We report a secret base under a mountain where they use sleeping people to turn suffering into fuel for a time machine. The reality of their situation crashed down upon them. They were trapped between a collapsed entrance and a technologically advanced enemy that saw them as data points. They had uncovered a secret so vast, so classified, that there was no one in the world they could tell. Hans was staring at the journal they had left on the floor. He picked it up, his expression shifting from despair to a grim resolve. Then we do not report it, he said quietly. We become the report. We go back. We find this core. And we do not stop it from the outside. He looked at Barnes and Ellis, his eyes burning with a cold fire. We stop it from the inside. The decision was made. There was no going back. The surface war was someone else's fight now. Their war was here, in the dark, against an enemy that wanted to unmake the world. They were no longer just lost soldiers. They were a secret mission, the only one that mattered. December 20th, 1944. The air in the bunker was no longer still. It thrummed with a deep, resonant energy that seemed to emanate from the very rock beneath their feet. The faint, sterile light from the vent shaft now pulsed with a slow, rhythmic crimson, like a dying heartbeat. The Avalon facility was waking up. Lieutenant Barnes, Private Ellis, and the German prisoner Hans stood at the edge of the vent, looking down into the abyss they had just escaped. Going back was madness. It was suicide. But it was the only choice that remained. Hans held the Avalon journal tight in his hands. He said we were a data source, our fear, our rage. He looked at Barnes, his eyes clear for the first time. So we give them none. We become nothing. Ghosts in their machine. Barnes nodded, understanding the impossible task. To shut down all emotion, to become cold, calculating instruments, it was the only way to move unseen. We find the core. We destroy it. Nothing else matters. They dropped back into the sterile corridor. The change was immediate and terrifying. The once silent hallway was now filled with a low, pervasive whisper, like 1,000 voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing. The sleeping converters in the barracks were no longer serene. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, their bodies twitching against their restraints. The nightmare data was flowing at full capacity, and they were drowning in it. They moved like shadows, avoiding the patrolling guards by staying in the service ducts and maintenance corridors Hans had noted on the facility schematics in the journal. The place was a labyrinth, a fusion of cold Nazi efficiency and something else, something alien and advanced. They passed rooms containing banks of whirring machinery that glowed with vacuum tubes, their purposes incomprehensible. They saw libraries filled not with books but with crystalline data rods that shimmered with internal light. The deeper they went, the stranger the environment became. The air grew colder. The walls transitioned from concrete to a smooth metallic alloy that felt warm to the touch. The hum intensified, vibrating in their teeth and bones. It was the same hum from the bunker, but magnified 1,000-fold. It was the sound of the Götterdämmerung event building to its climax. Finally, they reached the heart of the mountain. The corridor ended at a circular balcony, overlooking a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in darkness. Below them lay the core. It was not a machine, it was a landscape, a forest of crystalline pillars, each one stories high, pulsed with a sickly green light identical to the sample Turner's team had found in Normandy. In the center of this forest was a sphere of pure darkness, a hole in reality that seemed to drink the light from the room. Energy, visible as arcs of white lightning, crackled from the crystal pillars into the sphere, and surrounding the sphere, connected by glowing filaments of light, were hundreds of the unconscious converters, floating in a complex, rotating array. Their collective nightmares were the fuel, and the sphere was the engine. On a platform suspended over the abyss stood Director Valerius and Dr. Adler. They were watching a massive view screen that showed the same silent, wingless aircraft Ellis had seen before. But now, the scene was different. The aircraft were powering up. The soldiers in grey uniforms were forming ranks. They were preparing to cross. "The bridge is at 98% stability," Dr. Adler reported, her voice clinical. "The emotional resonance from the surface offensive has provided the final surge. We initiate the final sequence in 10 minutes. "Excellent," Valerius said, his voice filled with a terrible triumph. "The timeline known as Prime will be scoured clean. In its place, the Avalon timeline will be grafted. A world of order. A world without the chaotic, inefficient blight of free will." From their vantage point, Barnes saw their objective. At the base of the central crystal array was a control console, isolated and unguarded. It was the only thing that wasn't glowing. The off switch. "There," Barnes whispered, pointing. "That's the target. It will be defended," Hans said. "Then we'll have to be quick." They found a maintenance ladder and descended into the pit of the core. The air was electric, smelling of ozone and something else, something like burnt sugar. The whispers were deafening here, a psychic onslaught of fear and pain pulled from across time and space. Ellis felt a wave of dizziness, visions of Stalingrad and the Somme flashing behind his eyes. He fought it down, clinging to the cold, empty place Hans had told them to find. They were halfway to the console when the alarm sounded. Not a siren, but a shift in the pervasive hum, a discordant shriek that tore at the mind. Valerius had seen them. The two Avalon guards from the corridor emerged from behind a crystal pillar, their dish weapons raised. There was no cover. No time for tactics. Barnes raised his .45. Ellis! The console! Go! Ellis and Hans broke into a sprint, weaving between the pulsating crystals. Barnes stood his ground, firing his pistol. The shots were swallowed by the immense noise. One guard fired his temporal weapon. A wave of distorted air shot towards Barnes. He dove to the side, but the edge of the field caught his leg. He cried out as the limb aged instantly, the flesh withering, the bone becoming brittle. He collapsed, unable to stand. Ellis glanced back, his resolve almost breaking. Barnes! Go! The lieutenant roared, firing his last rounds at the advancing guards. Ellis and Hans reached the console. It was a nightmare of unlabeled switches and dials, written in an unknown language. The journal had no information on this. What do we do? Ellis yelled over the shrieking hum. Hans's eyes were wide, scanning the controls. He was a farmer's son, a conscript. This was beyond him. The despair began to creep back in. They had come all this way for nothing. Then Hans's eyes fell on something. A simple red lever, protected by a clear glass case. It was the only thing on the console that looked like a manual override. An emergency stop. There, he shouted. He smashed the glass with the butt of a discarded tool from the floor. He grabbed the lever. He looked at Ellis, then back at the sphere of darkness, where the ghostly images of the future army were becoming solid, real. He pulled the lever. Nothing happened. For a heart-stopping second, Ellis thought they had failed, that it was too late. Then, the world broke. The shrieking hum became a deafening roar. The green light from the crystals flared into blinding whiteness. The arcs of lightning feeding the sphere reversed direction, tearing back into the crystals. The sphere of darkness itself began to convulse, shrinking and expanding violently. On the view screen, the image of the future army flickered, distorted. The soldiers looked down at their own hands, which were becoming translucent. The wingless aircraft began to break apart, not with explosions, but with a silent unmaking. "What have you done?" Valerius screamed from the platform, his voice filled with a fury that was not entirely human. He raised his hands, and the very air around Ellis and Hans began to warp, to tear. But the cascade failure was already underway. The crystals, overloaded with feedback energy, began to explode. One after another, they shattered like glass, each detonation sending a shockwave through the cavern. The floating converters began to wake, their screams of terror adding to the cacophony as they fell from their harnesses, plunging into the darkness below. The Avalon guards, caught in the temporal backlash, flickered and vanished. Dr. Adler was consumed by a flash of green light that erased her from existence. Valerius stood amidst the chaos, his form beginning to glitch, to pixelate. He looked at Ellis, his pale eyes burning with a promise that transcended time. "This is not over, variable. We are in every branch. We are in every shadow. We are—" His voice cut out as his form dissolved into static and was gone. The entire mountain was coming apart. The ceiling of the cavern began to collapse, massive chunks of rock crashing down, obliterating the remains of the core. Ellis and Hans ran, stumbling through the disintegrating landscape. They found Barnes, dragging him between them. They fought their way back to the ladder, climbing as the world fell to pieces beneath them. They burst out of the vent shaft and into the bunker for the last time. Without pausing, they scrambled towards the collapsed entrance. As if in answer to their desperation, a tremendous shockwave from deep below slammed through the mountain. The rubble sealing the entrance shifted, and a sliver of grey, winter light pierced the darkness. They squeezed through the gap, collapsing into the snow of the Ardennes forest. Behind them, the mountain imploded, the entrance vanishing into a cloud of dust and snow. The Avalon facility, the core, the nightmare of Project Mnemosyne, was buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock. They lay in the snow, gasping, bleeding, but alive. The sound of battle was distant now. The German offensive was stalling. Hans was the first to sit up. He looked at the can of spam that had started it all, still lying where Ellis had dropped it days before. He picked it up. He looked at Ellis, and for the first time, a genuine, unburdened smile touched his lips. "So veal," he whispered again. "So much." But this time, it was not a statement of disbelief. It was a statement of gratitude. He had helped save a world where such abundance was possible. He was no longer a prisoner. He was a liberator. The three men, American and German alike, had fought a war within a war that would never be recorded. They had looked into the heart of a darkness that sought to consume time itself, and they had prevailed. The cost had been immense, but as they sat in the snow, watching the sun break through the clouds, they knew it was a cost worth paying. The future, for now, was safe.